The honourable member from Kildonan and St. Paul has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And here we are 2 months into the longest privilege debate in House of Commons history and Canadian history. 2 months of Liberals running from accountability after your ruling, an agreement with the opposition parties that they must produce the documents. Of course, as you know, Mr. Speaker, this is a constitutional power that we have in this House, that the House can compel the order of documents, persons, papers. This was ruled, and for 2 months, the Liberals have been working very hard to avoid their real obligation to this House, to circumvent their constitutional obligation after a ruling in this House to bring forward documents on a $400 million green slush fund. And of course, we know that it was $400 million taxpayer dollars that a board of Liberal-appointed board members used to enrich themselves. In fact, there were 186 conflicts of interest over a number of years by those Liberal-appointed board members. 186 times. This was happening every other day at this board, where they would vote of how this money would be spent to their own financial benefit. And the Liberals are withholding all the documents. They've provided some that have been redacted, but they have not released all of them. They have not provided them unredacted. We are saying they need to provide them to the police. This is such a significant scandal. $400 million, far less have brought down Liberal governments before for their scandals and corruption. But $400 million is not nothing. The last time I spoke in this House, I talked about how $400 million taxpayer dollars for individuals to vote to enrich themselves with, that represents about 22,000 Canadian families working an entire year paying federal income tax, just to afford $400 million towards Liberal insiders. And so we've ordered the documents. They refused to give them. For 2 months, this House has largely been at a standstill. 2 months, again, the longest privilege debate in Canadian history, the longest debate. So that just begs the question of what are they hiding in there? It must be really bad for them to forego anything else, really, and I'll talk about some of the things that the NDP has allowed them to get away with. But 2 whole months of no government bills being passed, no government bills really being debated. 2 months. And this is a minority parliament. We could be in an election at any time. Time is of the essence if this Liberal government in its dying days wants to accomplish anything, and yet 2 months of that waning time, they've been running from this accountability. So that, I mean, it's very obvious. It's very clear that there is something very serious in those documents, as we suspect. I think the Liberal corruption in this likely runs far, far deeper. Why else would they allow 2 months of none of their initiatives going forward? Why else? There's no other logical explanation for this, Madam Speaker. I think it's quite serious what we're looking at. And of course, we've seen a lot of this kind of behavior over the last number of years. Liberals proroguing Parliament to avoid scandals, Liberals calling election to avoid production of the Winnipeg lab documents. You'll remember that, Madam Speaker. Called an election in the middle of a pandemic, the most divisive election in recent memory, where the Liberal Prime Minister pitted vaccinated Canadian against unvaccinated Canadian. Called that election to avoid what was in those Winnipeg lab documents that involved 2 scientists connected to the People's Liberation Army in China. Called an election to avoid releasing those documents. In fact, an individual was brought to the bar to get those documents, which was the first time in a century, and yet they fought hard to make sure that those didn't come to light. Called an election to avoid it. And of course, the prorogation was in the midst of the We Charity scandal, when they were looking to provide $1 billion to that sort of what really amounted to quite a slimy organization, the We Charity, who was also a sycophant for the Liberal family, or the Liberal Prime Minister's family, Madam Speaker. You know, promoting them, paying them to be in various speaking engagement podcasts. It was really something. So we've seen this before: prorogation to avoid accountability, calling an election to avoid production of documents. So maybe one of those 2 things is coming. How far are they going to take this to avoid the RCMP looking at these documents? Again, just the ones that we know about, which is not to say there's many, many more conflicts of interest, but the ones that the Auditor General was able to find after looking at, over just a portion of the $1 billion green slush fund. 186 times, every other day, I guess, Liberal-appointed board members were voting for taxpayer dollars to further enrich themselves. It's unbelievable, actually. It's unbelievable how many people in this country had to work all year away from their families, had to pay federal income tax for for $400 million to be in conflicts of interest to enrich Liberal insiders, Madam Speaker. It's quite shocking, and I just think two whole months avoiding this, sacrificing their own agenda and their waning days of government, it must be really bad, Madam Speaker. There's no other explanation. And I think if you just look at their whole sort of green initiatives over 9 years, it's quite something. I mean, if you really peel back the layers, they've claimed to have spent, what is it, $100 billion on climate change? $100 billion with no meaningful results whatsoever. $100 billion. It's a shocking number, and yet no results. No results. In fact, we saw, the Environment Commissioner in a 2023 fall report said, and I'll quote, the report painted a grim picture of emissions reductions in Canada over the past 20 years, saying that the only significant drop in emissions came during the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, which had little to do with emissions reduction policy. So in the midst of the pandemic, when we were all forced to stay home for weeks, not drive, not travel, not do anything, not really leave our houses or see anybody, that's what emissions dropped. There was no other meaningful emissions drop in this country since the Liberals have been in office. And in fact, the Environment Commissioner went on to say Canada is the only G7 country that has not achieved any emissions reductions since 1990. Wow, $100 billion and no results. From the Office of the Auditor General, she said Canada's greenhouse gas emissions have increased since the Paris Agreement was signed, making it, quote, the worst performing of all G7 nations since the 2015 conference of the parties in Paris, France. That was in 2021. So we're seeing all this money just flying out the door. And in fact, they brought forward something called the Net Zero Accelerator Fund. And what I found really interesting about this is they propose $8 billion. Again, just billions are just nothing to Liberals. Doesn't matter how long and how hard Canadians had to work to produce all those federal income taxes. But whatever, they're going to spend billions like it's chump change in the bottom of their pocket. So $8 billion towards this Net Zero Accelerator Fund. And what's really interesting about this is they found that there was no accountability really on the money to reduce emissions. So they're just throwing billions of dollars to various companies with no measurables. Nothing to show the public, well, we gave them this and they committed that they would help lower emissions at this regard, and we'll hold them accountable to that commitment for making their companies billions of dollars from the taxpayer. That lack of accountability is seen across government departments here. In fact, the government in particular, the Liberal government, makes all these big financial announcements. Doesn't matter that we've doubled the national debt from $500 billion to well over $1 trillion in 9 years, almost 150 years of prime ministers. All their debt was done in less than 9 years by Liberal government. And they talk about all these billions, and yet, of course, there doesn't seem to be really any measurables. It's like a ribbon cutting and announcing all these billions, and then that's all we have to do. It's not really about what the actual impact of those dollars are. It's as if they think success is measured by how much money you spend, not by the outcome it produces. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of this so-called green spending. And in fact, in some cases, the government didn't know if the accelerator fund provided would lead to any emissions reduction. In fact, the Environment Commissioner Environment Committee said themselves, quote, we also found that the department did not always know what extent GHG emissions have been reduced by those companies that took part in the Net Zero Accelerator Initiative, or whether the funding provided would lead to reduced emissions. So again, how could you just disregard the hard work it took for Canadians to provide that money to the federal government and just throw it out the window with no follow through over and over and over again? So then it's not just on the greenhouse gas emissions that we're not seeing any meaningful action, despite nearly $100 billion apparently, according to them, spent. It's all different departments. In fact, if you look at the economics of this country and all the billions, of course, they measure success by how much money they're spending, not on the outcome. Because if you just look at the outcomes, what have we seen, Madam Speaker? We have 1 in 5 children in Canada are living in poverty. 1 in 5. 1 in 5 children living in poverty. 1 in 4 parents, reportedly, are cutting back on their own food intake because they can't afford enough for all of their families. So they're eating less so their children can eat. 1 in 4. That's from the Salvation Army. 1 in 4. This is supposed to be a G7 country, one of the wealthiest countries on earth. We're the second largest geography on earth. We're blessed with natural resources that almost every other country would envy. We have an educated population, a hardworking population, a kind population, and yet we have 1 in 4 parents cutting back on their own food intake. We have 1 in 5 children living in poverty. We have 2 million people visiting a food bank every month. Bread lines have returned after 9 years of Liberal government, actual bread lines. It's just unbelievable what we're seeing, and yet they've spent all this money with the promise at every single announcement that this was going to make the difference, and yet it's just made things worse. What have they spent on housing? What is it, $80 billion on housing, and housing prices, rental prices have doubled in the 9 years that they've been in power? $80 billion spent on housing. All that taxpayer hard work spent on housing, only for housing to double in cost. Actually, it's more than double now. Rent has more than doubled now. What is it, 2/3 of millennials will never be able to afford a home? Was the hallmark of Canadian freedom and prosperity was to the promise that you could work hard and get married and have a family and buy a house and retire in dignity, things that were true for generations because of the hard work of the earlier generations in this country, built on their blood, sweat, and tears, the promise of Canada to provide prosperity. And now we have 2/3 of our young people who are probably the most, I know they are, the most educated in history, hardworking, big dreams, and yet 2/3 of them will never be able to afford a piece of property. We have the second largest geography on earth. We have trees that abound. We have all the materials you need, all the space required to build homes, and $80 billion of so-called investment from the Liberals, and housing prices have doubled, and the dream of housing ownership for 2/3 of my generation has evaporated after 9 years of this Liberal government. And to say nothing of the crime that we're seeing, the dysfunction that we're seeing in our criminal justice system, where we're seeing 50% increase in violent crime, we're seeing 116% increase in gun crime, we're seeing 75% increase in sexual assault, which we know the vast majority affects women. And at every opportunity, this government pats itself on the back for its feminist policy, and yet 75% increase in sexual assaults in this country in 9 years, 120% increase in sexual violations against children in this country in 9 years. And they've brought forward subsequent pieces of justice legislation that has a serious influence on this, that has resulted in a lot of this crime. We've heard from police associations across the country, premiers of every political stripe saying it's bail. Bail reform is needed in this country, Madam Speaker. That's what we hear time and time again. And yet nothing. They brought forward a measly 7-page bill that was passed into Royal, sent over, but it was a year ago now, had obviously zero effect. People are still being shot and killed by people out on bail, who have been out on bail and probation and parole for their whole lives, and yet somehow they're just let out on bail again with a promise that they'll obey the rules for the first time in their life, and yet they've proven to be a danger to society over and over again. It's madness. It is madness what we're seeing. People deserve to feel safe in this country. They deserve to ride public transit without the threat of being stabbed by someone out on bail. They deserve to have their car in their own driveway and know it's going to be there in the morning. It used to be like that in Canada. We used to have a time where you weren't concerned about things like this, and it just seems to be getting worse. We've seen thousands of homeless encampments pop up all across the country, which is, of course, a clear indicator of the poverty and economic vandalism that we've seen as a result of bad government decisions from these Liberals for 9 years.